They couldn't beat each other, so they changed the rules. Whitby woke slowly, as if the sea itself controlled the rhythm of the town. The tide pulled back from the dark rocks, revealing slick stone and tangled lines of seaweed that clung stubbornly to the shore. Gulls circled overhead, their sharp cries cutting through the low, constant murmur of water. The air carried salt, damp wood, and the faint metallic trace of fresh catch unloaded before sunrise. Nothing here rushed. Every movement, every sound, followed a pattern older than memory. The harbor formed the center of that pattern. Boats rocked in place, tied to worn posts that had been replaced so many times they no longer belonged to a single generation. Nets hung like heavy curtains, dripping steadily onto the wooden planks below. Fishermen spoke in short, efficient phrases, their conversations shaped by routine rather than curiosity. This was not a place for spectacle. It was a place where work defined identity, and consistency was valued more than innovation. Adrian Hale stood inside his tavern kitchen, already deep into that flow. The door to the back alley remained slightly open, letting in the cold morning air along with the distant sound of the harbor. He preferred it that way. It kept the kitchen honest. No artificial warmth, no separation from the source of his ingredients. Everything connected. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface marked by years of use. Cuts, stains, faint burns. None of it hidden, none of it repaired beyond necessity. Adrian worked over it with controlled precision, his knife moving through a line of fresh fish laid out in perfect order. Each cut followed the same angle, the same pressure, as if deviation itself would be a form of failure. He did not think while he worked. Thinking implied uncertainty, and uncertainty had no place here. The fish had been caught at dawn. It needed to be cleaned, portioned, and prepared before the first customer arrived. Timing was not flexible. It was absolute. A crate sat near the door, still damp from transport. Adrian stepped toward it, lifted the lid, and inspected the contents without visible reaction. Mussels. Clean, tightly closed, their shells dark and unbroken. Acceptable. He nodded once to himself and carried the crate to the table, integrating it into the sequence of tasks already unfolding. Nothing interrupted the flow. Everything joined it. The tavern itself remained quiet, but not empty. It held presence. Thick wooden beams crossed the ceiling, darkened by decades of smoke and heat. The walls displayed old photographs, each one slightly faded, each one documenting a moment that had once mattered enough to preserve. Fishermen standing beside oversized catches. A group gathered outside the tavern long before Adrian had owned it. Faces repeated across different years, aging slowly, predictably. Adrian had grown up with those images. They were not decoration. They were reference points. Proof that the tavern had always served a purpose larger than profit. He had inherited that purpose, and he treated it with the same discipline he applied to his work. Change was not forbidden. It was simply unnecessary. Across town, the same morning unfolded under a different logic. The streets narrowed as they moved away from the harbor, the buildings leaning slightly toward each other, as if sharing quiet conversations above the heads of passers-by. Here, the air shifted. Less salt, more warmth. The scent of baking bread, herbs, and something subtly sweet replaced the sharp clarity of the sea. Alice Bennet stood inside her bistro, surrounded by light. Large windows captured the pale morning sun and spread it across the room, softening the edges of everything it touched. Unlike the tavern, nothing here felt fixed. Tables could be rearranged. Decorations changed. Even the menu existed in a state of constant revision. She leaned over a long work table, studying a collection of vegetables laid out in small, deliberate groupings. Each item had been selected with care, but selection was only the beginning. She lifted a beetroot, turning it slowly in her hand, observing the subtle variations in color beneath its rough surface. Her expression remained focused, but not rigid. She allowed for possibility. "This one," she said, placing it slightly apart from the others. "It needs something sharper." Her assistant waited, expecting a clear instruction, but none came immediately. Alice did not operate through strict sequences. She built ideas through adjustment, through reaction. She reached for a small jar, opened it, and inhaled briefly before adding a measured amount of its contents to a bowl. Vinegar, but not standard. Infused. Altered. Balance first, she continued, more to herself than to anyone else. Then structure. Where Adrian removed uncertainty, Alice explored it. Her kitchen functioned through controlled experimentation, each decision leading to another, forming a chain that could change direction at any moment. Failure was not avoided. It was filtered, refined, turned into something usable. The bistro reflected that mindset. Clean lines, light wood, simple arrangements that could shift without resistance. Nothing carried visible history, yet everything felt intentional. It was not a place built over time. It was a place continuously being rebuilt. By late morning, Whitby moved into full awareness. Market stalls filled the central square, their displays arranged to attract attention without excess. Fresh fish on crushed ice, bundles of herbs tied with thin string, loaves of bread stacked in uneven towers. Conversations overlapped, creating a low, steady hum that replaced the earlier quiet. Adrian moved between stalls with practiced efficiency, selecting his usual staples without a second glance. His world was a sequence of proven results. But as he reached for a bundle of wild thyme, he noticed Alice at the neighboring stall. She wasn't just buying. She was debating the aroma of a new oil with the vendor, her hands moving with a fluid, restless energy that defied his sense of order. He didn't speak, but for the first time, he watched. The rigid architecture of his morning didn't collapse, but it vibrated with a new, uncatalogued frequency. The market reached its peak just before noon, when the narrow streets of Whitby could no longer expand to contain the movement within them. Voices layered over one another, vendors calling out prices, buyers negotiating with quiet persistence, baskets shifting from hand to hand. The air thickened with overlapping scents, crushed herbs, citrus peel, damp rope, and the unmistakable sharpness of rare spices displayed in small, guarded quantities. This was the only place in town where tradition and experimentation were forced into proximity, even if only for a few hours. Adrian moved through it with controlled efficiency, his attention fixed on specific targets. He stopped at a fishmonger he had known for years, exchanged a brief nod, and inspected a selection of shellfish without a word. The transaction was silent, precise, built on trust that required no reinforcement. He paid, secured the package, and shifted direction without hesitation. Every step followed an internal map. He rarely looked up. The market did not interest him beyond its function, until something disrupted that pattern. It was not loud, not dramatic, just a slight pause in the movement around a small spice stall tucked between two larger vendors. The display itself was modest, glass jars, cloth bags, handwritten labels, but the selection was not common. Adrian noticed it immediately. That alone was unusual. He adjusted his path without fully deciding to, stepping closer, his focus narrowing on a specific jar placed slightly apart from the rest. At the same moment, another hand reached for it. Alice stopped just short of contact, her fingers hovering above the same container. She glanced up, not startled, but curious. Adrian's hand remained steady, not withdrawing, not asserting dominance. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The noise of the market continued around them, but the space between them felt separate, contained. "You saw it first?" Alice asked, her tone neutral, observational rather than confrontational. Adrian's gaze shifted from the jar to her, measuring without judgment. "We reached at the same time." A small pause followed. Not awkward, analytical. "Then it depends on intention," she said, lowering her hand slightly, but not stepping back. "What would you use it for?" The question was direct, but not invasive. Adrian considered it. Most people in the market did not ask why. They asked how much. "Structure," he replied. "It holds under heat without losing its edge." Alice's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Recognition, not agreement. Only if you control the timing," she said. "Otherwise it collapses into bitterness." Adrian studied her more carefully now, not as a stranger, but as someone operating within a familiar system from a different angle. "You've used it before." "Not successfully," she admitted, a faint hint of satisfaction in the honesty. Yet, the vendor watched the exchange with quiet amusement, saying nothing. This was not a negotiation about price. It was something else entirely. Adrian reached for the jar, then stopped, his hand hovering for a fraction longer than necessary. He shifted it slightly toward Alice. "Take it." She raised an eyebrow, not expecting that outcome. "You're certain?" "I don't need it today," he said. The statement was true, but incomplete. Alice held his gaze for a moment, as if testing the validity of his reasoning. Then she accepted the jar, her grip firm but not possessive. Then I'll make sure it's used properly. A brief silence settled again, lighter this time. Next time, Adrian added, almost as an afterthought, you might want to consider pairing it with something neutral first, to stabilize the base. Alice smiled slightly, not dismissive, but engaged. Or disrupted intentionally, she countered. Depends on what you want the dish to do. For the first time, Adrian allowed a trace of something beyond neutrality into his expression. Not agreement. Interest. They did not exchange names. There was no need. The interaction had already moved beyond introduction into something more precise. Recognition of method, of intent, of discipline shaped differently, but built on the same foundation. Alice stepped back first, turning the jar in her hand as if reassessing it with new variables in mind. Then I suppose we'll both find out, she said, more to herself than to him. Adrian gave a small nod, already shifting his focus back to the market. The moment closed without formality. No conclusion, no expectation. Yet as they moved in opposite directions, something had altered. Not in the town, not in the market, but in the quiet space each of them carried internally. A reference point had been established. Unnamed, undefined, but present. Neither of them realized that the next time they would meet, it would not be as strangers sharing a detail. It would be as competitors forced to define that detail against each other in full view of the entire town. The annual food festival arrived without announcement, yet no one in Whitby needed one. The signs had been there for days. Longer hours at the docks, fuller deliveries, quiet adjustments behind closed kitchen doors. By the time the first stalls appeared along the main square, the entire town had already shifted into expectation. This was not a celebration in the usual sense. It was a test. Tables lined the streets in careful order, each assigned, each measured. Temporary kitchens were assembled with practical precision, nothing decorative beyond what could survive wind from the sea. Smoke began to rise in thin streams, carrying early signals of what would follow: grilled fish, slow reductions, herbs hitting hot oil. The air thickened, but not chaotically. Every participant understood the stakes. Adrian arrived early, as he always did. His station was set without variation, clean surfaces, minimal tools, ingredients arranged in exact sequence. He did not look around. Distraction had no function here. The festival, for him, was simply an extension of the same principle he applied every day. Consistency under pressure. Across the square, Alice's station carried a different energy. Her setup was organized, but flexible. Ingredients were grouped by potential rather than sequence. Small containers, labeled in quick handwriting, stood ready to be combined, adjusted, redefined. She moved through them with calm focus, but her attention remained open, ready to adapt. The crowd gathered gradually, forming a loose perimeter around the competing kitchens. Conversations lowered as the first dishes began to take shape. This was the moment Whitby paid attention, not out of curiosity, but out of habit. They had seen this before, year after year. What mattered was not the format. It was who controlled it. Adrian worked without hesitation. Fish met heat at the exact point it needed to. Nothing earlier, nothing later. Each movement followed the last with mechanical clarity, yet nothing about it felt lifeless. Precision created its own form of intensity. There was no space for doubt, and no evidence of it. Alice approached her dish differently. She began with framework, but allowed it to shift as she worked. A taste, a pause, a slight adjustment. Another taste. Her focus narrowed and expanded in cycles, each one refining the direction rather than locking it. Where Adrian eliminated variables, she shaped them. For a time, they remained unaware of each other. Not because they could not see across the square, but because neither of them allowed their process to break. Until the first reaction from the crowd began to separate into patterns. A cluster formed near Adrian's station first. Quiet approval. Nods. The kind of response built on familiarity executed perfectly. Nothing unexpected, but nothing flawed. Then, gradually, a second cluster gathered near Alice. Different energy. Less immediate certainty, more engagement. People leaned in, asked questions, reacted visibly to what they tasted. Not all reactions were identical, but they were active. It was enough to draw attention. Adrian looked up briefly, following the shift without turning his head fully. His gaze crossed the space and settled, for the first time, on Alice. Recognition came instantly, not emotional, but structural. The same person from the market. The same element, now placed in a direct line of comparison. Alice sensed it a second later. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze across the distance. This time, there was no neutrality between them. Context had changed everything. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The realization was immediate and complete. Competitors. The word didn't need to be said. It defined itself through the space between them, through the alignment of their stations, the direction of the crowd, the silent measurement already taking place. Adrian returned to his work first, but the rhythm had shifted just slightly. Not broken, but sharpened. Every movement now carried an added layer of intent. Not just correctness, but superiority. Alice felt it too. The openness in her process narrowed, not into rigidity, but into focus with a target. Her next adjustment was no longer exploratory. It was deliberate, aimed. The festival continued around them, but for both, the environment had reduced to a single axis. Action and response. Move and counter. Later, when the initial presentations concluded and the crowd dispersed into smaller discussions, the organizers moved through the stations, marking results, preparing announcements. The outcome mattered, but not as much as the shift that had already occurred. Adrian cleaned his workspace with the same discipline he had started with. No sign of exertion, no visible reaction to the competition. Yet his awareness remained fixed across the square. Alice finished later, her process extending until the last possible moment. When she finally stepped back, she didn't look at the organizers. She looked at him. This time, neither looked away immediately. There was no hostility. Not yet. But the space that had once held quiet curiosity now held something sharper. Defined. Professional interest had become opposition. And unlike the market, this was no longer a moment that could pass without consequence. The beach lay beyond the edge of Whitby, where the last narrow street gave way to open space and the structure of the town dissolved into wind and distance. Few people came there after sunset. There was nothing to sell, nothing to prove, nothing to measure. Only the steady tempo of waves and the distant beam of the lighthouse cutting through the dark in slow, deliberate intervals. Adrian did not plan to be there. His path had followed habit at first, a need to step away from the density of the town after the festival. The competition had ended hours ago, the results announced, the reactions processed and stored away. He had returned to the tavern, closed the kitchen, reviewed what could be improved. Everything had been accounted for. Everything except the one factor he had not expected to carry beyond the square. He noticed her only when the light shifted across the sand. Alice stood closer to the waterline, her outline partially broken by the movement of the tide. She was not looking at him. Her attention remained on the horizon, as if the town behind her had already been set aside. For a moment, Adrian considered turning back. This was not a space defined by rules he recognized. There was no architecture here, no sequence to follow. But he did not leave. He adjusted his direction slightly and walked forward, his steps controlled even on uneven ground. Alice heard him before she turned. The sound of movement carried differently on sand, softer, but impossible to hide completely. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable at first, then settling into something neutral. Not welcoming, not dismissive. "You're consistent," she said, her voice steady, carried lightly by the wind. "Even outside your kitchen." Adrian stopped a few steps away, maintaining distance without making it obvious. "You stayed longer than necessary," he replied. Alice turned fully now, facing him. "Necessary for what?" "The festival ended," he said. "That doesn't mean the process did." A brief silence followed, but it did not carry tension. Not yet. It felt more like adjustment, two systems recalibrating in a space where neither held full control. "The spice," Adrian said after a moment. "Did it hold?" Alice's expression shifted, a trace of something sharper appearing beneath the surface. "It didn't collapse," she answered. "But it didn't behave the way you predicted either." Adrian considered that. "Then you changed the structure." "I didn't stabilize it," she corrected. "I redirected it." Another pause. The lighthouse beam passed over them briefly, illuminating the space between them before moving on. "You lost points for inconsistency," Adrian said, not as criticism, but as fact. "And you lost for predictability." Alice replied, matching his tone exactly. The exchange settled between them, balanced. Neither defensive, neither yielding. This doesn't need to extend beyond the square, Adrian added. Alice studied him more carefully now, as if evaluating not the words, but the intention behind them. You mean the competition? Yes. And what about the rest? There is no rest, he said. The answer came too quickly, too complete. Alice noticed it. That's the difference, she said quietly. For you, everything has to resolve into a system. For me, it doesn't. Adrian did not respond immediately. The statement did not fit into an alignment he could address directly. The wind shifted, stronger now, pulling at the edges of their conversation. We're not the same, he said finally. No, Alice agreed. We're not. The agreement did not create distance. It clarified it. For a moment, neither spoke. The absence of words did not feel empty. It felt precise, as if anything added too quickly would disrupt something that had not fully formed yet. Alice broke it first, but not by leaving. She stepped closer to the water, then stopped, her attention still divided between the horizon and him. I don't bring the kitchen here, she said. Not the competition, not the expectations. It's the only place where that line holds. Adrian followed the direction of her gaze, though he did not move. Lines exist to be maintained. Or crossed, she said. He looked at her again, more directly this time. That creates instability. That creates change. The words landed without conflict, but not without weight. Another pass of the lighthouse light. This time, it lingered just long enough to define both of them clearly against the dark before fading again. Adrian stepped forward, closing part of the distance, though not all of it. The movement was small, but deliberate. Then we keep the boundary, he said. Here and there. Separate. Alice held his gaze, measuring the offer. It was not compromise. It was containment. A truce, she said. Not a truce, Adrian corrected. A division. She considered that, then gave a slight nod. Outside the kitchen, no competition. Yes. And inside, no exceptions. The terms settled between them, clear, defined. Alice extended her hand, not as a gesture of formality, but as confirmation. Then we don't bring this into the town. Adrian looked at her hand for a fraction longer than necessary, then took it. His grip was firm, controlled, but not distant. We don't. The contact lasted only a moment, but it was enough to finalize something neither of them had expected to establish. When they let go, the space between them changed again. Not reduced, not expanded, redefined. They did not stay much longer. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to clarify. The agreement existed, and both understood its limits. As they walked back toward the town, they did not walk together, but they did not move in opposite directions either. The distance between them remained constant, measured without effort. The lighthouse continued its slow rotation behind them, marking time without interfering. Adrian looked at the harbor, then back at Alice. The competition was over, but the work was just beginning. Tomorrow, he said. It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was a schedule. Tomorrow, Alice agreed. Behind them, the lighthouse beam swung around, marking the dark water with a rhythm that was no longer theirs to control, but finally theirs to share. For now, the boundary held. The arrival of Mr. Blackwood did not happen with ceremony, but with effect. Within 3 days, Whitby began to feel the shift before anyone fully understood its source. Notices appeared in shop windows about development opportunities. Unmarked vehicles passed through the harbor more often than usual. Conversations at the market lowered in volume whenever unfamiliar suits were seen near the docks. It was not disruption yet. It was preparation for it. Adrian first heard the name from the town council meeting he did not intend to attend, but attended anyway after a brief message from the tavern supplier. The room was too small for the number of people inside it, and the air carried the uneasy weight of decisions already made elsewhere. Blackwood Holdings, someone said at the front, pointing to a projected plan. Acquisition proposal for the coastal strip. The image showed something clean, geometric, and unfamiliar. A structure that did not belong to Whitby, even in concept. A food complex. Unified vendors. Standardized output. Optimized flow. Adrian listened without expression, but something in his posture changed. Not visible tension, but alignment. Recognition of threat without emotional interpretation. Across town, Alice heard it in a different context, from a supplier who arrived late and unusually quiet. He avoided eye contact while unloading crates. "They're offering buyouts," he said eventually. "Not just leases. Ownership transfers." Alice paused mid-check of an ingredient order. "Who is that?" The answer came reluctantly. "Blackwood." That was the first time the name became real in her mind. Not abstract development. Not rumor. A defined force with intent. By evening, the town had already started dividing itself into positions. Not openly, not yet, but structurally. Those who saw opportunity. Those who saw risk. Those who refused to see either. Adrian and Alice did not speak that day. They did not need to. The separation they had agreed upon still held, but something external had begun pressing against it. The first direct meeting with Blackwood happened in the tavern. Not planned, not requested, simply arranged by timing and proximity. He entered without urgency. That was the first noticeable detail. Mr. Blackwood did not rush because he did not expect resistance. His presence was calm, measured, and slightly too controlled to be natural. Two assistants followed a step behind, carrying nothing visible but observing everything. Adrian stood behind the counter. He did not greet him immediately. He waited. Blackwood looked around the tavern slowly, as if evaluating not the space, but its viability. "Authentic," he said finally. "Not as praise, as classification." "This is not for sale," Adrian replied. Blackwood smiled faintly, as if the statement confirmed something already assumed. "Everything is for sale. It only depends on timing." He placed a folder on the counter. No force, no urgency, just placement. Inside were documents, projections, numbers, reductions in maintenance costs, increases in efficiency, scalability models. All clean, all detached from context. Adrian did not open it. "You're part of the old structure," Blackwood continued. "That foundation is inefficient. Emotionally attached systems are predictable in failure." "I don't operate on your model," Adrian said. "That's why I'm here," Blackwood replied. "To correct that inefficiency." There was no hostility in his tone. That made it worse. At the same time, across town, Alice received a similar visit, though less direct. A representative, not Blackwood himself. The message was identical in structure, different only in delivery. Opportunity, expansion, stability. She declined before the sentence was fully finished. The representative did not argue. He simply left a card. By the time night returned to Whitby, the pressure had become visible in smaller ways. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Decisions were delayed. Plans reconsidered. And then came the second wave. Not persuasion, but implication. Adrian's tavern lease was mentioned in a local administrative review. Nothing illegal. Nothing confirmed. Just uncertainty introduced into stability. Alice's supplier prices shifted without explanation. Not enough to break her operation. Enough to force recalculation. It was not destruction. It was calibration pressure. And it was coordinated. The distance between them remained, but the nature of it had shifted from professional rivalry to a shared, wordless vigilance. When they finally stood together in the harbor office, responding to the same administrative summons, the silence was no longer a wall, but a bridge. "He's not just buying property," Alice said, looking at the notice in her hand. Adrian watched the movements of the clerks behind the glass. "He's dismantling the logic of the town to make room for his own." The documents did not stay on the counter for long. Adrian placed them inside a drawer without looking at them again, but their presence remained in the room like a second pressure layered over the air. Not visible, not urgent, persistent. He returned to work, but the rhythm had changed slightly. Not broken, adjusted. Every movement now carried an additional layer of awareness that had nothing to do with cooking. That same evening, Alice stood alone in her bistro after closing hours, the lights dimmed but not fully turned off. The space felt different without customers, less like a place of activity, more like a foundation being examined from the inside. She reviewed her inventory twice, not because she doubted it, but because she was testing stability under stress. The instability was not in the ingredients. It was elsewhere, external, coordinated. She didn't need confirmation to know Adrian had reached the same conclusion. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Pressure on suppliers, administrative noise, quiet financial adjustments, all converging at the same time from the same direction. Blackwood was not testing them individually. He was testing the system around them. Adrian arrived at the harbor office first the next morning. He did not wait inside. He stood outside instead, observing the flow of movement through the building. People entering, leaving, avoiding eye contact. Systems under stress always revealed themselves in human behavior before paperwork reflected it. Alice arrived minutes later. She slowed when she saw him, then continued forward without hesitation. The separation they had agreed on no longer applied in the same way. It had been overridden, not by choice, but by structure. They entered together, not coordinated, just aligned. Inside, the clerk behind the desk looked visibly relieved that neither of them intended to argue with him. That relief lasted only until Adrian spoke. "We want the same records," he said. The clerk hesitated. "Which records?" "Land acquisition proposals for the coastal zone," Alice added. Her tone was controlled, but sharper than before. Another pause, then compliance. As the documents were retrieved, neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because anything said prematurely would distort interpretation. They waited for data before forming response. When the files were placed in front of them, the structure became visible in full. Maps, boundaries, phased development plans, legal frameworks already drafted, names attached to sections that had not yet been publicly announced. Blackwood Holdings was not proposing change. It was executing it in stages already underway. Alice turned one page slowly. "This isn't negotiation," she said. Adrian's eyes moved across the documents with steady precision. "It's acquisition by progression. Controlled displacement," she corrected. Adrian closed the folder. He didn't look at Alice, but his voice dropped to a frequency that didn't carry past their immediate space. "Blackwood's system is designed to absorb individual elements. It has no protocol for a monolith." He pulled a folded, blank municipal form for asset integration from his coat and placed it on the desk between them. "If we sign this, we stop being targets. We become a legal deadlock." Alice looked at the document for a heartbeat, then reached for her pen. No words were needed. The boundary had not been broken. It had been expanded to include them both. A brief silence followed as both processed the same implication from different angles. The town was not being challenged. It was being restructured, and their restaurants were not exceptions. They were obstacles within that architecture. Outside, the harbor continued its routine. Boats arrived, nets were unloaded, transactions completed. Nothing appeared altered, but both of them now saw the underlying pattern behind the surface. Stability was still there. It was just being measured for replacement. When they left the office, they did not immediately separate. That in itself was new. The distance that had defined them since the beach agreement no longer functioned as before. External pressure had reduced its relevance. "You noticed the supplier changes," Alice said as they walked. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And the pricing shifts." "Yes." A pause. "Then we're being isolated first," she said. Adrian didn't disagree. "Yes." They stopped near the edge of the harbor, where the noise of activity faded into water and wind. "This only works if we remain separate," Alice said, her voice lower now. "That's the structure." Adrian looked toward the boats for a moment before responding. "Or if we adapt faster than it stabilizes." Alice studied him briefly. "That assumes we're still the variable." "We are," he said. "For now." The word carried weight neither of them needed to explain. For now meant limited time, limited control, limited window for response. They did not formalize anything further. There was no agreement, no new pact, only recognition that the previous division was no longer sufficient. As they finally turned in different directions, the separation returned, but not cleanly. It had been altered, slightly compressed, still present, but no longer absolute. Behind them, the harbor continued operating under the illusion of normality. And somewhere beyond the visible systems of Whitby, Blackwood's foundation continued to tighten its reach, quietly removing the space in which opposition could exist without coordination. The first false document appeared without warning. It was not delivered directly to Alice, nor shown to her by any official channel. Instead, it was placed where certainty would turn into suspicion before verification could intervene. On the doorstep of her bistro, in a plain envelope with no markings, as if it had always belonged there. Inside were printed pages, clean formatting, official-looking headers, signatures that mimicked procedural approval. At first glance, it looked like a routine financial disclosure connected to Adrian's tavern. At second glance, it looked like intent, negotiation, preparation for sale. Alice read it once without moving. Then again, slower. Her expression did not change quickly. It tightened gradually, as interpretation replaced observation. The language was deliberate, structured, designed to suggest inevitability rather than possibility. Adrian Hale, preliminary agreement discussions, asset transition review, confidential terms pending external approval. Nothing was explicitly illegal. That was not the point. The point was interpretation under stress. By the time she finished reading, her hands were still steady. But something in her focus had narrowed sharply. Not confusion, not doubt, direction. She did not call him immediately. That would have introduced noise into something that required clarity first. Instead, she folded the pages once and placed them on the table as if marking a boundary. When Adrian saw her later that evening, he understood immediately that something had already happened. Not because she spoke, but because she didn't. They met near the edge of the square where foot traffic had already begun to thin. The town continued moving around them, unaware of the shift that had already occurred between 2 points within it. Alice did not greet him. She simply held out the document. Adrian took it, read it once, then again. His reaction was different, not in intensity, but in process. Slower verification. Step-by-step rejection of validity. "This is fabricated," he said finally. "It's precise enough to look real," Alice replied. "It's structured to imply intent that doesn't exist. Or intent that hasn't been confirmed yet," she said. A pause followed. Not tension yet, but alignment breaking. Adrian looked at her more directly. "You believe this. I believe someone wants me to." The distinction mattered, but not enough to remove the effect. Silence stretched between them longer this time. The document remained in Adrian's hand, no longer just paper, but a disruption introduced into an already unstable system. "You didn't ask me first," he said. "You've been under pressure for days," she replied. "This didn't come from nowhere." "That's not an answer. It's a pattern," she said. "And patterns don't wait for confirmation." Adrian's expression remained controlled, but the foundation of his response shifted slightly. "If I had agreed to anything like this, you would already know." "I don't know that anymore," Alice said quietly. That sentence changed the space between them more than anything before it. Not accusation, not certainty, erosion. Adrian held the document lower now. "This is meant to isolate interpretation," he said, "not reveal truth." "Then it's working," she replied. A pause. Longer. Neither of them moved. The separation they had maintained since the beach was still technically intact, but it no longer functioned cleanly. External interference had altered its stability. Trust was no longer assumed. It had become conditional. "You think I'm involved," Adrian said. "I think someone is trying to make it look like you are," Alice corrected. "And I don't know why yet." "That should be enough to discard it." "It's not," she said. The honesty of that answer carried more weight than agreement would have. Adrian looked away briefly, not from avoidance, but from recalculation. "Then Blackwood is no longer applying pressure externally," he said. "He's inserting conflict internally." Alice didn't respond immediately. The logic fit. Too well. "They want us to divide," she said. "Yes. And this is the method." "Yes." Another silence followed, but this one was different. It was not uncertainty. It was recognition of strategy. Still, recognition did not erase effect. Alice stepped back slightly, not leaving, but restoring distance. "I needed to see your reaction," she said. "You got it," Adrian replied. "And I still don't have certainty." "No," he said. "You don't." The admission was not defensive. It was factual. The night air shifted around them, colder now, as if the town itself was adjusting to the change in their alignment. "We can't operate on assumption," Adrian said finally. "We already are," Alice replied. That was the point neither of them could ignore. The system had succeeded in introducing uncertainty at the exact point where coordination mattered most. Adrian looked at the folded pages in his hand, then back at the harbor office. The uncertainty Blackwood had introduced required a structural response that bypassed the competition entirely. He didn't tell Alice yet, not because of a lack of trust, but because the maneuver required absolute, silent execution before the window closed. And for the first time since Blackwood's arrival, their shared opposition had fractured into something less stable. Not broken, but no longer reliable. The announcement of the Whitby Culinary Cup arrived through official channels the next morning, posted on municipal boards and repeated across local networks with careful neutrality. On the surface, it was presented as a celebration of local cuisine, a tradition meant to highlight regional identity and attract seasonal attention. Beneath that language, both Adrian and Alice immediately recognized something else. Structure, timing, control. The prize was not money. It was permanence. A long-term municipal protection clause attached to the winning establishment, effectively shielding it from redevelopment or acquisition. The kind of legal safeguard that could freeze ownership status indefinitely. It was too precise to be coincidence. Adrian read the notice twice before setting it down. The tavern was quiet at that hour, but the silence no longer felt neutral. It felt measured, as if the environment itself had become part of the competition. Across town, Alice received the same information from a different source, but the meaning did not change. She did not react immediately. She simply closed her laptop and sat back, processing the implication without interruption. This was no longer pressure. It was selection. By midday, registration had already begun. Not formally for them. Their participation was assumed. The entire town understood that if Adrian and Alice did not enter, the cup would lose its relevance entirely. They did not discuss it in advance. They did not need to. Their coordination had been damaged, but not erased. Certain conclusions still aligned independently. The first time they spoke about it was in passing, near the edge of the harbor where movement was slower and conversations could exist without being immediately absorbed into public awareness. "You're entering," Alice said. It was not a question. "Yes," Adrian replied. A pause followed. "So am I," she said. "Yes," he answered again. No surprise. No disagreement. Just parallel decisions converging on the same point. The structure of the competition was released later that day. 3 stages. Ingredient selection, controlled execution under time constraints, and final presentation judged by both regional chefs and external investors. The last detail mattered more than the rest. External investors. Neither of them said Blackwood's name, but they both understood the implication. That evening, Adrian worked longer than usual in his kitchen, not preparing dishes, but testing variables. Heat control, timing adjustments, stability under interruption. Not because he expected failure, but because the environment had shifted from predictable to externally influenced. Alice did something similar, though her method differed. She introduced variations into familiar processes, observing how small changes affected outcome consistency. She was not preparing a fixed plan. She was preparing adaptability. The competition was not about cooking anymore. It was about control under observation. On the morning of the cup, Whitby changed character again. The square was redesigned with temporary structures, but this time they were more deliberate than the festival. This was not celebration. It was evaluation. Cameras were installed. Viewing platforms arranged. Seating reserved for officials and investors who did not belong to the town's usual flow. Blackwood was not visible yet, but his presence was implicit in the design itself. Everything was optimized for visibility, comparison, and judgment. Adrian arrived first at the preparation area. He did not look at the audience seating. He did not acknowledge the cameras. His focus remained internal, contained. Alice arrived shortly after. She paused briefly at the edge of the space before stepping in. Their eyes met once across the distance. No greeting. No acknowledgement beyond recognition. The separation between them still existed, but it had been compressed by necessity. The first stage began without ceremony. Ingredients were revealed simultaneously, forcing immediate adaptation. The room filled with controlled movement, selection, rejection, prioritization. Adrian worked with precision, minimizing uncertainty through foundation. Alice worked with responsiveness, minimizing risk through adjustment. The crowd watched, but neither of them was performing for it. They were solving separate problems under identical constraints. As the stage progressed, the tension did not come from competition alone. It came from awareness that every decision was now being observed not just for quality, but for vulnerability. And somewhere beyond the visible edge of the event, the real evaluation had already begun. The second stage of the cup began with a controlled silence. Not absence of sound, but suppression of it, as if the space itself had been compressed to prioritize observation over expression. The remaining ingredients were no longer simple materials. They were constraints. Each selection carried consequences that would not appear immediately, but would define stability under pressure later in the process. Adrian entered the stage with immediate structure. His movements were minimal, almost surgical. Every ingredient placed had a defined purpose within a sequence already mentally established. There was no hesitation because uncertainty had already been removed at the planning level. What remained was execution under scrutiny. Alice approached differently. She did not commit fully at the start. Instead, she built in layers, testing combinations, adjusting proportions, discarding assumptions before they could stabilize into error. Her process was adaptive, not linear. Where Adrian reduced variables, she redistributed them. The audience reaction began subtly. Not applause, not commentary, but attention shifts. People leaning forward. Judges exchanging brief glances. Investors noting differences in approach rather than outcomes. The competition was no longer about taste alone. It was about method under visibility. Midway through the stage, the first disruption occurred. Not dramatic, not obvious. A subtle interference in Alice's preparation space. A minor misplacement of a key ingredient crate, just enough to create delay without halting progress. Adrian noticed the disruption immediately. A technician had moved a crate of essential infusions just out of Alice's reach, a subtle, artificial friction. Without breaking his own sequence, Adrian adjusted his reach, sliding a backup container of the same base herb across the shared prep line. It was the same rare spice from the market, the element Adrian had initially judged too volatile. Now, in Alice's hands, it didn't collapse into bitterness as he had predicted. Instead, it released a new, uncatalogued aroma that filled the space between them. He realized then that his structure wasn't just holding heat. It was providing the spice with a foundation it had lacked on its own. It was a silent, mechanical handoff. He didn't look at her, and she didn't thank him, but the rhythm of the kitchen synchronized. For the first time, the two systems weren't competing for space. They were sharing a frequency. Alice corrected the disruption quickly, but the effect remained measurable. Time lost. Sequence adjusted. She compensated, but compensation itself was a form of cost. Across the upper seating, Blackwood observed without expression. He did not interfere directly. He did not need to. The system around them now contained enough pressure points that minimal intervention produced measurable divergence. The stage continued. Adrian's execution remained stable, predictable in foundation, but increasingly refined. Each movement reinforced consistency under observation. Alice's execution remained flexible, less predictable, but more responsive to disruption. Each adjustment revealed new configurations rather than reinforcing old ones. The contrast between them was no longer subtle. It was visible in cadence, in pacing, in how each handled deviation. As the stage neared completion, the judges moved closer, narrowing focus. Notes were taken more frequently. Conversations became shorter. The evaluation had shifted from outcome to resilience. And resilience, in this context, had two definitions that could not be reconciled. Stability through the tasting process was slow, deliberate, fragmented into analysis rather than enjoyment. The crowd remained silent in a way that felt enforced by attention rather than rules. Adrian did not look at Alice, not because of avoidance, but because there was nothing to gain from observation at this stage. The system had already moved beyond their control. Alice did look at him once, briefly, not for judgment, for confirmation that he understood the same thing she did, that this was no longer just about food. Then came the interruption. A shift in movement at the edge of the square. Not loud, not dramatic, but structurally significant. Blackwood stepped forward for the first time into full visibility, no longer observing from distance, now participating in outcome. The investors followed his movement instinctively. The judges paused slightly before continuing. The system adjusted to his presence without formal acknowledgement. He did not approach the dishes. He addressed the space. "Before the decision is finalized," he said calmly, "I would like to clarify the purpose of this evaluation." No one responded. He continued anyway. "This competition was never about cuisine," he said. "It was about viability. Systems that can withstand integration into a larger framework." Adrian's posture changed slightly. Not defensive, focused. Alice's expression tightened, not in surprise, but recognition. Blackwood looked toward the judges. "Whitby is dying in the grip of its own nostalgia. You call it tradition, I call it decay. My structure is the only way to save this town from becoming a museum piece." This decision determines which approach is strong enough to survive the transition into the future. The meaning shifted everything. The cup was no longer a protection mechanism. It was a selection tool for assimilation. Adrian finally spoke. This was never disclosed. It was implicit, Blackwood replied. Alice stepped forward slightly. You engineered the conditions. I optimized them, he corrected. Silence followed. He had not denied anything. The judges looked unsettled, but not empowered to intervene. The architecture had already been accepted at institutional level. Their role was now procedural, not authoritative. Adrian glanced briefly toward Alice. The first true exchange between them since the competition began. Not emotional. Operational. We're not competing for a prize, he said quietly. No, Alice replied. We're competing for control of outcome. Blackwood smiled faintly. You're competing for relevance. That word landed differently. Not victory. Not failure. Relevance. The final judgment was about to be delivered, but the meaning of winning had already been rewritten in real time. And for the first time, both Adrian and Alice understood the same possibility at the same moment, that the only way to prevent absorption was no longer to win individually, but to change the structure of what winning meant. The silence that followed Blackwood's revelation was not empty, it was pressurized. Adrian looked at the dish he had prepared, a masterpiece of structural integrity, and then at Alice's, a study in vibrant, controlled chaos. Separately, they were exactly what Blackwood wanted. High-value assets ready for extraction. Adrian was the first to move. He didn't look at the judges or the investors. He looked at Alice, and in that silent exchange of data, the final synchronization occurred. The distance they had maintained since the beach vanished, replaced by a single, shared front. You're looking for scalable assets, Adrian said, stepping forward. But your algorithm missed the human variable. You calculated our efficiency based on us working against each other. Alice stood level with him, her eyes cold. You want to buy a result you can replicate in 100 other towns. But our kitchens don't run on standard operating procedures. They run on the history of this harbor, something your spreadsheets can't quantify. We aren't two competing businesses anymore. We are a single, unified disruption. Adrian stepped forward, his voice dropping into the cold, rhythmic tone of a man who had already calculated the endgame. The documents we processed at the harbor office weren't just for research, Mr. Blackwood, Adrian stated, his voice steady. We filed for a formal merger under the Whitby Heritage Act. As a unified entity, we now hold a majority share of the historic district's commerce, triggering a mandatory 5-year stay on all external acquisitions. You weren't bidding on 2 restaurants. You were trying to breach a locked vault. Under the current coastal protection bylaws, a unified entity with over 60% market share in local heritage dining is exempt from external acquisition for a period of 5 years. You weren't bidding on 2 restaurants. You were trying to buy a locked vault. Adrian nodded once. Starting tomorrow, the tavern and the bistro operate as one entity. My structure, her adaptation. 1 kitchen, 2 locations, 0 room for your acquisition model. The realization hit the square like a change in the tide. By merging, they hadn't just combined menus. They had created a hybrid system that Blackwood's rigid corporate algorithms couldn't categorize, let alone control. They had rendered his data obsolete. Blackwood looked at the two of them, the man of stone and the woman of light, standing together. He saw the flaw in his plan. He had counted on their rivalry to keep them weak. The crowd, once silent, began to shift. A low murmur of recognition turned into a steady, rhythmic applause that started at the docks and moved toward the center. In Whitby, a town built on the predictability of the tides, the people recognized a new, stronger current when they saw it. Blackwood glanced at the cameras, then at the growing wall of local faces. The optics of a forced takeover had shifted from modernization to siege, and for a man of his calculations, the cost of the conflict had just exceeded the value of the asset. He hadn't accounted for the possibility that the 2 most powerful forces in Whitby would choose to stabilize each other. Without another word, Adrian and Alice turned away from the judges, from the cameras, and from the man who tried to own the flow of their lives. They walked out of the square, not in opposite directions, but together. As they reached the harbor, the lighthouse beams swung around, catching them for a brief second before moving on. That was an unstable move, Adrian remarked, his pace matching hers perfectly. Inconsistency is a form of power, Adrian. Alice replied, her eyes reflecting the dark sea. You'll get used to it. Perhaps, he said, and for the first time, the rigidity in his shoulders gave way to something new. But only if we maintain the architecture. Or disrupt it, she whispered. Above them, the gulls cried out, and the tide began to pull back from the rocks, revealing a shore that belonged to no one but the sea. The town of Whitby woke slowly, but for the first time in centuries, the pattern had truly changed.